Serving the amateur radio community for the past 22 years all around the world, you have found This Week in Amateur Radio. We are North America's premier amateur radio and technology news magazine and bulletin service of the air. Here are the stories for release around the earth as we come to air with edition number 1188 of This Week in Amateur Radio. The International Amateur Radio Union is reporting another over-the-horizon radar system on the low bands, and it is now under construction in India. Belgium is planning to resume in-person amateur radio exams in the first quarter of 2022. The radio regulator in Australia, the ACMA, is seeking comments on proposed licensing changes to amateur radio in that country. The Dayton Amateur Radio Association is planning to host a live in-person event for next year's Dayton Hamvention. There are two 160-meter contests taking place this month. One is active right now as we are on the air, and the other coming up later in the month, but they both give nod to the 1921 Transatlantic radio tests. We will tell you all about them. The fall ARRL section manager election results are in. We will have all the results. Arrl USA announces new senior leadership. We will introduce you to them. And imagine being able to power your HT without relying on batteries. Scientists say it's possible, and we will tell you all about it in this week's report. These headline stories will come to you in a moment along with this week's special features. We'll visit with Bruce Page, KK5DO, and get an update from AMSAT and what's new with all of those amateur satellites in orbit. Our technology reporter, Leo Laporte, W6TWT, will talk a little more about the current chip shortage and proposed resolutions, and he will take a look at virtual reality and the new upcoming augmented reality system coming in 2022 from the folks at Apple. Australia's own Arno Benshoff, VK6FLAB, will present a proposal in his piece entitled One Time Zone to Rule Them All. Our own amateur radio historian Bill Continelli, W2XOI, returns with another edition of the Ancient Amateur Archives. This week, Bill takes a look at the amateur happenings during the 1960s and early 70s that finally led up to the technician class liberation that finally took place in 1972. Our tower climbing and antenna master, Greg Stoddard, KF9MP, will take a look at some general mounting resolutions for the tower in your yard. That's all straight ahead as North America's premier amateur radio and technology news magazine and bulletin service, This Week in Amateur Radio, takes to the air right now. Reporting from our headquarters studio, somewhere just outside Albany, New York, I'm George, W2XBS.
And reporting from the newsroom in Half Moon, New York, I'm Terry Saunders, N1KIN.
And reporting from our news bureau in Rochester, New York, along the southern shore of Lake Ontario, where winter is already settling in and making itself at home, I'm Dave Wilson, WA2HOY.
And reporting from the Catskill Mountains of upstate New York, where the grass is green after the snow has melted and gone away, and it's supposed to be 50 degrees here in a couple of days, I'm Don Hulick, K2ATJ.
And from Studio 1 of our chilly Central Florida News Bureau, I'm Fred, November Fox 2 Fox.
And reporting from our Troy, New York News Bureau, where the days are getting short and cold, I'm Eric, KD2, RJX.
I think Will had a little bit too much turkey. The tryptophan kicked in. Hey, Will, wake up.
No, not sleeping. Power nap. I'm awake and reporting from our news bureau in Fayetteville, Arkansas, where Mother Nature's not reading the calendar these days. I'm Will Rogers, K5WLR.
And now with this week's lead story, here is Terry Saunders, N1KIN.
Leading off the news this week, in October, the International Amateur Radio Union Region 1 Monitoring System newsletter reported on the continuing run of over-the-horizon radar troublemakers that often cause severe interference on amateur radio bands, primarily in IARU Regions 1 and 3, but are audible in the rest of the world. Now, another threat is looming, the International Amateur Radio Union Region 1 says. IARU Region 1 has cited a report by Alpha Defense India that the Defense Research and Development Organization, Premier Radar Development Laboratory, is working on an over-the-horizon radar system to keep a close eye on Chinese movements in the Indian Ocean region. The system design has already been completed according to the report. The prototype stage comes next. According to the report, the radar prototype is to have 2 different types of radar arrays, a log periodic wire antenna array and a broadband monopole antenna array. It is believed that the log periodic antenna array will be used to determine the best maximum usable frequency, which is known to depend on current conditions in the ionosphere and the sunspot cycle. The monopole antenna will consist of a 32-element array. The actual system will be developed after extensive testing and evaluation, but the report gave no timeline or completion date. Over-the-horizon radars often massively interfere with amateur radio, the IARU Region 1 report said, citing the well-known Russian container over-the-horizon radar, an over-the-horizon radar at the UK base in the Republic of Cyprus, and others in Iran and China. They are present daily on several frequencies within the exclusive amateur radio HF bands, IARU Region 1 said. The best-known Chinese over-the-horizon radar, called Foghorn because of its distinctive sound, has signals at varying sweep rates that occupy 10 kHz of spectrum. The International Amateur Radio Union Monitoring System newsletter reported other over-the-horizon radars occupying 160 kHz of bandwidth with 10 scan per second rates. Depending on propagation, some familiar broadcast stations were also audible almost daily in Europe, including Radio Ethiopia on 7110 kHz, with an often very strong signal, the newsletter also reported.
Germany's National Amateur Radio Society, DARC, has responded to the CEPT Electronic Communications Committee consultation on non-beam wireless power transfer applications. Wireless power transfer is the transmission of electrical energy without wires as a physical link. In a wireless power transmission system, a transmitter device, driven by electric power from a power source, generates a time-varying electromagnetic field, which transmits power across space to a receiver device, which extracts power from the field and supplies it to an electrical load. The technology of wireless power transmission can eliminate the use of wires and batteries, thus increasing the mobility, convenience, and safety of an electronic device for all users. But an important issue associated with all wireless power systems is limiting interference to other radio spectrum users and avoiding the exposure of people and other living beings to potentially injurious electromagnetic fields. In the consultation, Draft Report 333 evaluates compatibility between non-beam inductive wireless power transmission applications in various frequency bands below 30 MHz and radio communication services such as the amateur services. The draft report is currently out for public consultation. The German Amateur Radio Society said that it expresses its support for undesirable emission limit values, which are set out in the report. The emission limit values guarantee a safe level of protection for all radio communication services. The DARC looks forward to further work on the inclusion of such limit values as presented in the European Radio Communications Committee recommendation. Included in the considerations is the fact that interference from wireless power transfer systems is cumulative. Multiple sources in close proximity will generate relatively greater interference. The DARC says that cumulative interference cannot always be precisely determined. Therefore, a typical reference limit value concerning a single device must be defined by a certain power factor below the interference field strength specified by the International Telecommunications Union for different environments, such as rural, residential, urban, and industrial. The DARC therefore advocates a limit value of 10 dB below the reference ITU specified interference field strengths for rural areas in every case, based on measurements under defined laboratory conditions for rural areas. This reference value would ensure a workable limit in all of the ITU environments. But at the moment, with the density of wireless power transfer devices expected to be greater in cities than in rural areas, acceptable interference levels are on a sliding scale, with urban interference field strengths set correspondingly higher. You can view the ECC public consultation page at www.cept.org/ECC and then follow the link to public consultation.
Shortly after announcing that it was suspending all amateur radio license exams through to the end of this year due to the pandemic, Belgium's regulator, The Belgian Institute for Postal Services and Telecommunications has scheduled its first examination in 2022 for Friday, January 7th. The test will not be given at BIPT facilities, which the regulator has deemed insufficient to comply with COVID precautions. The exam site will instead be the Euro Space Center, a science museum in Wallonia in the Belgium-Luxembourg province in southern Belgium. The testing procedures will be the same that are followed at the regulator's site. The announcement was made public on the website of the UBA, the National Amateur Radio Member Society. Candidates may test for the basic ECC Report 89 ON3 license, the CEPT Novice ON2 license, or the Herrick Full license. Meanwhile, Australia's regulator, the ACMA, is seeking input on two proposed changes affecting amateur radio licensees. The ACMA has proposed syllabus changes impacting the advanced, which is the full amateur license, and in a separate move seeks to restrict further issuance of two call sign suffixes associated with emergencies. The Australian Communications and Media Authority's proposal for the advanced license would adopt the exam syllabus from the CEPT recommendations, making the Certificate of Proficiency fully compatible with CEPT Herrick exams. Separately, the regulator is seeking to drop call sign suffixes SOS and PAN from future allocations because of their association with international emergency and distress calls. Hams with call signs already containing these suffixes will not be affected. Going forward, these suffixes will be added instead to a list of reserved call signs. The regulator invites comments on both of these proposals and asks hams to respond no later than the close of business Australia time on Monday the 13th of December. In another move, hams have been notified that the ACMA now requires all equipment sold or imported into Australia to comply with Australian Radiation Protection and Nuclear Safety Agency's electromagnetic energy exposure levels, simplifying the mandatory testing procedures for most amateurs.
Dayton Hamvention organizers are planning to mount the first in-person show in 2022, following 2 years of COVID-related cancellations. Rick Lindquist, WW1ME, has more in this report.
Hamvention is set for May 20th through the 22nd at the Greene County Fairgrounds and Expo Center in Xenia, Ohio. Hamvention General Chairman Rick Allnut, WS8G, says Hamvention committees have been meeting and volunteers are committed to making up for the time lost to pandemic cancellations. The Hamvention website is already accepting bookings from vendors and inside exhibitors, and individual visitors can already buy tickets, which all that said are all printed and ready to go. Nominations for the 2022 Hamvention Awards opened on November 1st. Hamvention seeks the best of the best nominees for its Technical Achievement, Special Achievement, Amateur of the Year, and Club of the Year awards. Nominations close on February 15th, 2022. For more information on Hamvention, www.hamvention.org. I'm Rick Lindquist, WW1ME.
Last January, Hamvention organizers from the sponsoring Dayton Amateur Radio Association announced they were calling off the 2021 event after considerable planning was already underway. The Hamvention Executive Committee cited lagging COVID-19 vaccine distribution in the U.S. and the emergence of a more communicable form of the virus. Nominations for the 2022 Hamvention Awards opened on November 1st. Hamvention seeks the best of the best nominees for its Technical Achievement, Special Achievement, Amateur of the Year, and Club of the Year awards. Nominations close on February 15th, 2022. Submit nomination forms via email or USPS to Hamvention Awards Committee, Box 964, Dayton, Ohio, 45401-0964. Contest University will take place on May 19th in conjunction with the annual Hamvention Super Suite activities, which will be moving to the Hope Hotel in Dayton. In addition to Contest University, these activities will include the Top Band Dinner, the Contest Dinner, and the KCDX Club CW Copying Competition, among other possible events.
In December, there will be 2 opportunities for 160-meter operators to fill the airwaves with activity and to test skills and stations on the 160-meter band. The events take place a century after the transatlantic tests of the 1920s, which ushered in the dawn of international amateur radio communication. For more details on both these contests, we go back to Rick Lindquist, WW1ME, who files this report from Arrl headquarters in Newington.
First off, it's the annual Arrl 160-meter contest, which begins Friday, December 3rd and ends on Sunday, December 5th, and which already may be history by the time you hear this. But wait, there's more. The Radio Society of Great Britain will activate special call signs to commemorate the centenary of the tests. Stations from the UK and Crown dependencies will use up to 7 different call signs, each having a 6 X-ray suffix. Also listen for UK stations appending the suffix 2ZE to the station's call sign. On December 12th, the ARRL and RSGB will jointly sponsor the 160-meter Transatlantic Centenary QSO Party 0200 to 0800 UTC to coincide with the 100th anniversary of the successful second transatlantic tests. CW-only stations will be trying to contact the 2 official call signs, W1AW and GB2ZE. They may be listening up if the crowd gets too rowdy and may periodically ask for DX only, exchange, call sign, and signal report. GB2ZE commemorates the call sign of Paul Godley 2ZE, who was sent by ARRL to the UK to lead the second transatlantic tests in December 1921. Details are on the ARRL website, www.arrl.org. I'm Rick Lindquist, WW1ME.
W1AW will be active for all 6 hours. Stations operating as GB2ZE will follow this schedule. 0200 UTC from the commemorative station at Androsen, Scotland. 0300 UTC from GM3YTS. 0400 UTC from GM0GAV. 0500 UTC from MM0ZBH. 0600 UTC from MM0GPZ. And 0700 UTC from GM4ZUK until 0800 UTC, or until the band closes at sunrise. The GMDX group will award a Quaish, which is a Scottish traditional drinking cup, representing friendship to the first stations in North America and the UK to complete contacts with both W1AW and GB2ZE during the QSO party. A commemorative certificate will be available for download. Participants will not have to submit logs. The official logs from W1AW and GB2ZE will be used to determine the winners and for certificates. For additional details, visit http://www.arrl.org/transatlantic or rsob.org/main/activity/transatlantic-tests.
In commemoration of the 100th anniversary of the first transatlantic test, the code practice text material for the week of December 6th through the 10th from W1AW will originate from the February 1922 issue of QST. It was in this issue the results of the transatlantic test were published. The February 1922 QST text material may also be used for subsequent code practice transmissions. The text will be taken from pages 14 to 18, 21 to 27, and pages 37 to 40 of the issue. The text files for each speed will soon be available for viewing online at awrl.org.
The only contested seat for section manager in the fall election cycle was in Kansas, where incumbent Ron Cowan, KB0DTI of Lacine, came out on top in the two-person race. Cowan outpolled challenger Lloyd Colston, KC5FM of Arkansas City, 260 to 225. Ballots were counted on November 23rd at ARRL headquarters. Cowan has served as Kansas section manager since 2003. His new 2-year term will begin on January 1st, 2022. In Alabama, Roger Parsons, KK4UDU of Mulga, will become the new section manager on January 1st. Parsons was the only nominee for the position. He has been an assistant section manager and a district emergency coordinator. Incumbent section manager Javon Martin, W4JVM, who has served as the Alabama section manager since 2016, decided not to run for a new term. In Michigan, Les Butler, W8MSP of Gregory, will become the new section manager of Michigan when the new year arrives. He was the only nominee to submit a petition by the nomination deadline. Butler will succeed incumbent Michigan section manager Jim Kovacic, K8JK, whose job will take him out of the state early next year. Kovacic has been Michigan section manager since 2018. In Delaware, the section manager position remains open, and a resolicitation for nominees will be issued this winter for an 18-month term beginning on July 1st, 2022. No nominating petitions were submitted before the deadline in September. Incumbent section manager Mark Stillman, KA3JUJ, is moving out of Delaware early next year and could not run for another term after serving as section manager since 2020. These incumbent section managers faced no opposition and were declared elected for new terms. David Stevens, KL7EB in Alaska. Mike Patterson, N6JGA in East Bay. Bill Mader, K8TE in New Mexico. John Kitchens, NS6X in the Santa Barbara section. David Thomas, KM4NYI in Tennessee, and Raymond LaJoy, AA1SE in Western Massachusetts.
Maine Section Manager Robert Gould, N1WJO, has resigned for personal reasons after serving since March 2020. Effective on December 3rd, ARRL Field Services Manager Mike Walters, W8ZY, has appointed Phil Duggan, N1EP, of Millbridge, Maine, as interim section manager to complete the current term, which ends on June 30th, 2022. Duggan is a retired U.S. Navy electronics technician chief and active in emergency communications. He served previously as Maine Section Emergency Coordinator. Duggan has been active in promoting amateur radio, especially among youth. Nominating petitions for the next Maine Section Manager term of office are due at ARRL headquarters no later than March 4, 2022. See the January 2022 issue of QST for the nomination announcement or the ARRL website for further details.
Last week, India's Ministry of Communication said that Elon Musk's SpaceX organization does not have the license to offer broadband internet services in India. Starlink is a satellite internet constellation operated by SpaceX, providing satellite internet access to most of the Earth. As of mid-2021, the constellation consists of over 1,600 satellites, but will eventually consist of many thousands of mass-produced small satellites in low Earth orbit, which communicate with designated ground transceivers. While the technical possibility of such a satellite internet service covers most of the global population, actual service can only be delivered in countries that have licensed SpaceX to provide services within any specific national jurisdiction. As of November 2021, the beta service offering is available in 20 countries. The Indian government issued an advisory asking citizens not to subscribe to the provider. It said that SpaceX's satellite broadband arm, Starlink Internet Services, is not licensed in India to offer satellite-based internet services and is barred from offering any such services in the country. The Department of Telecommunications has also asked the billionaire's Internet from Space company to comply with their regulatory framework. The department said that it had noticed that Starlink had started pre-selling the services in India, as is evident from its website, on which satellite-based internet services can be booked by users in Indian territory. SpaceX has been accepting orders for the beta version of its service for a fully refundable deposit of $99. That's 7,400 rupees. In a statement, the Indian Ministry of Communications said that the government of India has pointed out that Starlink Internet Services is not licensed to offer satellite-based internet services in India, even though they are advertising it to the public. Accordingly, the government has asked the company to comply with India's regulatory framework for providing satellite-based communication services and to refrain from booking or rendering such services in India with immediate effect. You can read the full article at www.timesnownews.com. Go to the Business Economy section.
The latest edition of the Eclectic Tech podcast, produced by Arrl, features a conversation about the technical aspects of the 1921 Transatlantic tests with Clark Burgard, N1BCG. He and Steve Ford, WB8IMY, also chat about on-air activities surrounding the upcoming anniversary. Here's a clip.
Actually, the first station they heard, or they thought they heard, was 1 AAW on 270 meters when they were just tuning around and getting the antenna set up. But the problem is that when they did some research to see who 1 AAW was, it turns out that the op who had those call letters hadn't had a station on the air in months. So it was a boot, and that was one of many wacky things that happened during that.
Eclectic Tech is available from the ARRL website and Blueberry.com.
The ARRL is seeking a ham with a professional journalism background to handle the ARRL's news function on a contract remote basis. Candidates for the ARRL news editor should be plugged into the ham radio community with a broad awareness of the major players, past and present, and the main issues, past, present, and potentially future, in the world of ham radio. Ideally, candidates will have a professional journalism experience, in particular, having a well-developed sense of knowing a potential news story when they see one, as well as how and where to research leads. The news editor creates news stories that are posted on the ARRL's homepage and is responsible for publishing the weekly e-newsletter, the ARRL Letter, which is populated mainly by those stories and augmented by some special weekly material, a solar weather report, a contest calendar, a conventions calendar, etc. The news editor is also responsible for creating the ARRL Audio News, a weekly audio show that presents stories from the home page and the ARRL Letter, and assembles the most relevant stories from ARRL homepage into QST's monthly happenings column. For more information, contact ARRL Publications and Editorial Manager Becky Schoenfield, W1BXY.
The QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo will return next year on the weekend of March 12th, 2022. The key to the Expo's reach and influence is the wide variety and scope of presentation and speakers that come to the Expo. From the thousands of messages that have been received since starting the Expo in August of 2020, presentations make a difference in the lives of amateurs who attend and view them, and they open the minds of amateurs to the possibilities that our amazing hobby offers to everyone, young and old. Unlike the conventions, meetings, and Hamfest, the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo has the ability to offer more opportunities for amateurs to make presentations that will be seen and shared by thousands of hams that come to the Expo every year. For more information about being a speaker and making a presentation at the Expo, and to apply, please visit the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo webpage and search for Speaker Call.
And now with the latest technology news and commentary from Petaluma, California. This Week in Amateur Radio is proud to present Leo Laporte.
Leo Laporte, the tech guy. Time to talk about computers and the internet. Any way that the internet and the computing and digital technology are changing our lives, that's what we talk about right here. And boy, they are, aren't they? We could talk about all of the various gizmos and gadgets in your life that have chips in them, which is pretty much, as we're learning, thanks to the chip shortage, everything. You can't buy a car. You can't buy a refrigerator. I'm still waiting for a stovetop. It's all in short supply. Good news, though, of course, and it's interesting to watch this happen. It's just economics, because chips are in short supply. Chip companies are going, we got to make more chips. It's not that they're making fewer. It's just the demand is huge. And so the chip companies are doubling their build out. They're building chip factories everywhere. Samsung just announced yet another plant in the United States in Taylor, Texas, $17 billion to build a chip plant. In fact, globally, chip makers are projected to spend about 50% more than before the pandemic and twice as much as they did 5 years ago, $146 billion this year. The people who make the chips, because they see this demand. Now, you know what that means, probably. In a couple of years, all of a sudden, all these factories are going to come online, and there's going to be a glut, which is good. I hope there's going to be a glut, because that means prices will tumble, right, when there's an excess supply. Now, maybe demand will double, too, though. That's part of the problem. Demand. People are buying more and more stuff with chips in it. I always say I'll talk about augmented reality. That's almost a joke, when I say we talk about augmented reality, virtual reality, real reality. It's because there's not much augmented reality out there. What is augmented? Well, you've seen VR. We've all seen that. That's like the Oculus Rift or the Quest or the HTC Vive. Those are those visors you put over your head. They've got two screens in them very close to your eyes. They're tied into a computer, or sometimes they have a computer built in, as in the case of the Quest. And you move your head. The Quest, these devices know that your head is moving, so they change the view. You look to the left, the view slides to the left. Look to the right, the view slides to the right. So it's as if you're in this virtual reality space, mostly used for gaming. You could use it for other things. There's some movie theaters that you can watch a movie on a screen, and you can see other people there, so you can look around and see the seats. I don't know why you'd want to do that, but okay. People do that. But mostly it's gaming. Augmented reality is a little bit different, because augmented reality, you still are looking at the world. And there are a couple of ways to do that. You could do it in glasses that you could see the world, but they display on top of the world, a heads-up display, if you will, information. So imagine you're wearing a pair of glasses, you're looking down Main Street, USA, and you see little pop-ups to the left and right with each store, and maybe you've told the glasses you're looking for dungarees, and it would show the stores that have dungarees and the prices, that kind of thing. They're augmenting, they're adding to existing reality. Another way to do it is to take the traditional VR glasses, goggles, where you can't see through them, and add cameras to the front so that on the screens you can project the world around you. That might actually be an easier solution. Just it looks dorkier because you got to have this big helmet on, or visor on. But as you're walking around, you don't run into walls because you can see. And by the way, they're getting close to that. You can see what's going on. If you had some cameras, you would see the world. It'd be like you're watching the world on TV. Just what we need, right? One more way to kind of separate us from the reality of the world. But that's what companies like Facebook, now Meta, are all about. It's like, oh, you don't need the real world. We're going to make a better fake world for you, and you'll spend all your time there. That's this whole new metaverse that Facebook's. That's why they renamed themselves. Well, that and another reason. People hate them, so maybe we change the name. People forget we're Facebook. They call themselves Meta because they're going to be, and you've maybe even seen the ads. Have you seen the ads? They're weird. They're like a cartoon with a tiger in the jungle and a toucan bird, and it's like you're walking through a cartoon space, and it says, something like "The future brought to you by Meta." I hope not. It's not. I don't know. Do you really? Is that what we want? I think it's fun for a game. I think it's fun for recreation. But the idea of putting these things on, and then even as you walk around, you're not really seeing the real world. You're seeing a view, a TV screen real world with stuff on it. That's what Apple is planning to launch next year, according to the rumor mill. Ming-Chi Kuo, who's very good usually about these rumors. He's an analyst who is in Asia and has a good connections with what they call the supply chain, the people who make this stuff. And so it's easier to get information from them, these Chinese factories, than it is to get it from Apple and Cupertino. Apple's, tight-lipped. But, these factory workers aren't making much money, and they're easy to bribe. And so you can get information out of them. So Ming-Chi Kuo says he thinks Apple's going to launch their first AR, augmented reality headset, 1 year from now, late 2022. It's going to look like, you're going to look like a steampunk kind of goggly wearing kind of person. with these. They're saying they're going to get dual 8K displays. That's pretty good. That's very high res. You need high resolution, right? Because you're right close to the screen. They're going to acquire these from Sony, 4K micro OLED displays from Sony. Oh, wow. Micro is, that's the hot new thing. The micro OLED displays. There are going to be two processors, one like the M1s that are in the Macs currently, and then there'll be another processor that'll handle all the sensors. It looks like it's sealed off, so it's one of those augmented reality things where you've got cameras, and as you walk around, the cameras are relaying your world around you, so you're watching TV as you're walking around. It'll do virtual reality as well as augmented reality. You know, I think there's a problem here socially. What do you think? You see somebody walking around with these, you know they have cameras on those, and they're recording everything they see. I think people don't like that. I remember when Google came out with something similar, maybe, what was it, a long time ago, like 6-7 years ago, Google Glass. People were getting beat up. You'd go into a bar wearing these things, and people go, "Get out of here with you and your dumb camera on your face." And I think we're even more privacy aware these days. So it'd be interesting to see the response. Maybe we'll just get used to it. Right now, if you go anywhere where there are people, especially in a city, more than half of the people walking around are staring at their phone. They're not looking at the world. They're looking at their phone, right? So now you can look at your phone without looking down. You'll have these silly goggles. I don't know. This is from the analyst's report. Apple's AR headset requires a separate processor as the computing power of the sensor is significantly higher than that of the iPhone. Wow, that's pretty fast. For example, the AR headset requires at least 6 to 8 optical modules, cameras, to simultaneously provide continuous video see-through AR services to users. You know, you might be able to see more than you can see with your eyes. In fact, you will be. You might get infrared data, heat, thermal imaging, sensing. You might have a field of view that's 180 degrees, complete peripheral vision. I don't know. Be interesting. This is what they're predicting for next year. Next holiday season. Anyway, I'm glad you were here, and I'm here, and I'll be here next week, and I hope you'll come by and bring your friends too as we talk high tech. Leo Laporte, the Tech Guy.
Are you ready for another trip into amateur radio history? I'm Bill Continelli, W2XOY, and I'll be back in a moment with another edition of the Ancient Amateur Archives, here on This Week in Amateur Radio.
Jock Elliott, KB2GOM, was a segment producer for This Week in Amateur Radio back about 7 or 8 years ago. As we approach the holiday season, here's a special segment that Jock produced for us back in 1998, and it is still relevant today.
Well, it's that time of year again. If you've got a roof-mounted antenna system like I do, you want to make sure that there are little lights that warn of the presence of guy wires and the other stuff that goes with keeping yards of aluminum in the air. Ordinarily, I don't pay much attention to that stuff. I mean, for 11 months of the year, who goes up on my roof? Just me once in a while, and occasionally one of my helpful ham friends. But in December, you see, things change. In December, there's the possibility of other rooftop visitors. I may be 52 years old, but I know which side my bread is buttered on, and I'm not taking any chances. If the jolly old elf decides to pay me a visit, I want to make sure there's a clear traffic pattern and a safe runway. I don't want to wake up on the 25th and find shreds of red cloth and reindeer fur hanging from the guy wires. No siree. I'm going to make sure those lights are hung by the antenna with care, so that St. Nick has no problem getting to my house. And so it is with visions of shiny transceivers dancing in my head that I got to thinking about Christmas presents for hams. Then I got to thinking about presents we could give each other as amateur radio operators, and I've come up with some that are low cost, and there are no payments until June 1999. Sorry, I've heard one too many holiday commercials. The first present that we can give each other is to try to be better operators. And one way to do that is to use a technique called pausing on the key. Put simply, it means when you're operating on an HF band or a local repeater, giving a little extra pause between the end of the last operator's transmission and before you begin yours. Pausing on the key provides a break in the flow of words, a moment or two of silence in which another ham might break in with emergency traffic or with a request to join the conversation.
Too often, especially when the subject is really interesting, it's too easy to rush our next transmission so that no one can squeeze a word in edgewise. Pausing on the key makes it easier for the next person to join the fun or pass some vital information. It's a low-cost present, and when you hear a repeater being operated with people pausing on the key, it's very, very classy. Another gift we can give to our hobby would be to spread the word about how neat ham radio is. Consider addressing a group of school kids, a civic organization, or a group of Boy or Girl Scouts. Give them a call. Tell them you're a ham radio operator and you'd love to tell them about amateur radio. Show up with a 2-meter rig, a shortwave radio, and a few maps, and you'll soon have them eating out of your hand. A small amount of your time could plant a seed that later could become a proud new ham. I once did a presentation to a den of Cub Scouts. To help them get what goes on with 2 meters, I had one of the Cubs stand on a chair and act as a repeater, relaying messages from me to the rest of the group. They got the concept right away, and then I let them ask questions of a pre-arranged Confederate using my 2-meter handy-talkie and the repeater. To my knowledge, none of them has yet become a ham, but there's still hope. Another present to give is to be an Elmer or mentor for someone who wants to be a ham. It doesn't matter whether they're young or old. In fact, I read recently in QST that a gentleman in his late 70s just got his first ham ticket. What matters is if they have an interest in the hobby and you can help, you can provide a great introduction to this wonderful hobby of ours. Another present is the gift of your physical help with another ham's projects. On several occasions, I have been the recipient of help in raising antennas, repairing equipment, and even the loan of equipment. I've got to say that overall, I am impressed with the ham community as being generous of its time, expertise, and treasure. Finally, each of us hams can probably find some way in which we can contribute to the public good. Many hams provide communications for public events, parades, or walkathons. Some run nets. Others produce radio programs. The bottom line, there's a good chance that you can give a gift of yourself through ham radio to the community at large. And when you do, don't be surprised if, in the end, you find you've received far more than you've given. Until the next time, I hope you and yours enjoy the peace and joy of the holidays. This is Jock Elliott, KB2GOM, with the Bent Element.
And now, with this week's edition of the Ancient Amateur Archives, here's Bill Continelli, W2XOY.
In our last installment, we saw how, when the FCC created the Technician Class License back in 1951, their intention was to give it a separate and unique purpose. The Commission stated that the Technician Class License was established expressly for serious-minded experimenters who needed spectrum space in which to conduct their tests. It was not established as a communicator service and was not to be a stepping stone between the novice and general class licenses. The original technician class operator only had privileges above 220 megacycles. In 1955, they were given 6 meters, and in 1959, the 145 through 147 megacycle segment of 2 meters. Getting additional frequencies for technicians was difficult. The petitions could not mention communications as a reason, but rather had to show that there was a need for additional experimentation on the 6 and 2 meter bands. Because of the experimental nature of the license, technicians were not allowed to become racy stations. They also faced some discrimination by a few higher class amateurs. In fact, several proposals were made to the FCC to punish technicians who used the airwaves to communicate rather than to experiment. In 1962, 2 events occurred. First, the FCC denied petitions to give technicians the 29.5 through 29.7 megacycle segment of 10 meters, as well as full 2-meter privileges. In rejecting these petitions, the FCC stated there was considerable misunderstanding about the role of the technician class and restated the experimental policy they had issued back in 1951. Also that year, a new amateur publication hit the market, VHF Horizons. Concentrating on 6 meters and above, this magazine was full of technical articles, construction projects, contest information, and VHF news. But it was the editorial content of VHF Horizons that broke new ground. For the first time, an amateur magazine called for a rewrite of FCC policy. They wanted technicians to be considered full-fledged amateurs and not just experimenters. Naturally, this caused controversy in the amateur community. Technicians who considered themselves communicators flocked to this new publication, while some higher-class amateurs condemned it and restated their position that communicating technicians were violating FCC policy. Unfortunately, VHF Horizons was not able to turn a profit and expired after only 2 years. In 1967, the FCC instituted incentive licensing. While the actual frequency loss by technicians was minimal, just the first 100 kilocycle CW segment of 6 meters, the FCC still struck a blow to those wishing to remove the experimenter status from this license. The FCC once again turned aside requests to expand technician privileges to the full 2-meter band. In addition, the FCC also removed 2-meter voice privileges for novices and took away the right for an amateur to simultaneously hold a novice and technician license. According to the Commission, too many novices were operating 2-meter voice, were not increasing their code speed, and were upgrading only to technician instead of general when their novice license expired. Once again, the 1951 policy was restated. However, despite the FCC's position, thousands of technicians were on the VHF bands as communicators. With the rise of 2-meter FM, new technicians were taken to the airwaves every day, mostly with surplus wideband commercial equipment. Recognizing that the role of this class of license had evolved, the ARRL Board of Directors met on November 1, 1969, and came to a decision. In an editorial in the December 1969 issue of QST entitled Technicians as Communicators, the ARRL's new position was stated. Technicians were no longer experimenters, but rather full-fledged communicators. The ARRL proposed that they be given the full 2-meter band, the 29.5 to 29.7 megacycle segment of 10 meters, and the ability to once again hold a novice license simultaneously. The ARRL put these proposals before the FCC in a petition. The FCC did not immediately respond to this petition, but rather, in 1971, issued an odd ruling in which they stated that a technician class amateur could not use a repeater in which the input was in the technician subband of 145 through 147 megacycles, but the output was above 147. Nevertheless, since the repeater subband in the early 70s was 146 through 148 megahertz, and the technician was not allowed above 147, the FCC was under pressure. On October 17, 1972, technicians were given the 147 through 148 megahertz segment of 2 meters. The FCC denied technicians 10 meters, novice privileges, and the 144 through 145 megahertz segment of 2 meters, but the door was opened. With thousands of technicians on 2-meter FM, the FCC then moved slowly towards full VHF privileges for them, realizing that the experimenter designation was obsolete. In 1975, technicians were given novice frequency privileges. When the new repeater subband was opened at 144.5 through 145.5 megahertz, technician privileges were expanded to 144.5 through 148 megahertz. The FCC also realized that technicians could no longer be excluded from RACE's operation. In 1976, the FCC eliminated the mail order status of the technician exam and required applicants to show up at an FCC examination point. Finally, in 1978, technicians received full 2-meter privileges. In the eyes of the FCC, they were full-fledged amateurs. In 1987, the exam was made easier by splitting Element 3, the general written exam, into 3A for technician and 3B for general. Also in 1987, technicians received sideband privileges in the 28.3 to 28.5 megahertz segment of 10 meters. And, in a final act of technician liberation, In 1991, 40 years after the license was established, the code-free technician was created. So, if you meet a technician who has been licensed since the 1960s, treat him or her with dignity and respect, for they have suffered and endured years of being ostracized so that today's technicians can enjoy full VHF and UHF privileges. In our next installment, we will look at the development of repeaters and repeater regulations. I hope you will join me.
And now, with this week's Propagation Forecast Report, we go back to Rick Lindquist, WW1ME, who reports from League headquarters.
Tad Cook, K7RA in Seattle, reports solar activity was up this week. Average daily sunspot numbers increased from 26.9 to 46.1, and the average daily solar flux was up by nearly 11 points to 90.9. The space weather woman, Tamitha Skov, WX6SWW, said conditions should be looking up.
We only have a small M-flare risk, so the risk for radio blackouts is pretty mild, but we are managing to stay in that marginal range for radio propagation, almost into the good range, because solar flux is maintaining itself in the low 90s, and that's going to easily continue with all these new bright regions beginning to emerge. So enjoy.
Space weather woman, Tamitha Skov, WX6SWW. Time now for the AMSAT report. As 2021 winds down, we look to the future. AMSAT President Robert Bankston, KE4AL, presented AMSAT's strategic plan for the future of AMSAT at the AMSAT Symposium earlier this year. Of course, more satellites are always in the plan, and many aspects are aimed especially at schools and youth. See the complete plan at amsat.org/strategic plan. FunCube 1, or AO73, has celebrated its 8th birthday, with the solar panels losing most of their illumination due to the orbit following the edge of the terminator. The satellite has been placed into safe mode. The downlink RF is now just 20 milliwatts. Even with low power, many stations are still able to copy the telemetry. Another distance record, Chris AA8CH and Jose EB1AO worked each other on AO27 for a distance of 6,125 kilometers. That's 3,794 miles if my math is correct, on November 20th. That is really a feat to accomplish, as the satellite is on a very short timer. The AMSAT report comes to us each week, courtesy of Bruce Page, KK5DO.
The Chinese Radio Amateurs Club, CRAC, which is the official ham radio body in China, reports on the risk in the country of collecting and distributing either shipping automatic identification systems data or aircraft automatic dependent surveillance broadcast data, and the threat to radio amateurs that can come from some media misreporting. Recently, in television and other media, reports have appeared that a very small number of individuals and enterprises in China, through their own receiving devices, are obtaining and relaying ship and flight data to overseas in real time. The Chinese authorities consider this a risk to national security, and radio amateurs may get mistakenly caught up in the issue. A new law introduced by Beijing appears to have resulted in ships turning off their automatic identification system beacons when in Chinese waters. By the way, these operate on either 161.975 MHz or 162.025 MHz. An Australian newspaper report says that since the start of November, vessels from around the globe, from tankers to cargo ships, have disappeared from global tracking systems as they have entered some of the world's busiest shipping lanes close to Chinese ports. As the ships leave Chinese waters, they reappear again. By some estimates, tracking pings from ships near China have fallen by 90% in just a few weeks. On November the 1st, a new law came into effect in China, restricting foreign access to any data, potentially including shipping data, deemed to have a bearing on national or economic security. On the same day, a report on the government-controlled China Central Television Focus news program stated that suspicious radio equipment had been found in the home of a radio enthusiast close to a military base and commercial port in Zhanjiang in the country's south, west of Hong Kong. The broadcast said that a radio ham had installed the equipment which would aid in the global tracking of ships in real time via the internet. The accused, described as a radio ham, had no qualms about his activities. After all, collecting data on the movement of ships is nothing new. The principal way that maritime vessels are tracked is through the Automatic Identification System, or AIS, which is a kind of air traffic control for the seas. It uses transceivers fitted on vessels to transmit their position. This data is then picked up by other vessels, satellites, or AIS base stations on land. The information can show an individual vessel's position, its speed, name and destination, and it's considered vital in modern shipping and allows ships, particularly in busy sea lanes, to know where the position of other vessels are to avoid collisions. It also gives an overview of maritime congestion and allows anyone who wants to keep a tab on commercial vessels. A potential problem is that many who undertake these activities are not amateur radio enthusiasts at all. The radio reception equipment is just the tool of their trade. However, due to the lack of a basic understanding of what amateur radio is, or a general poor clarity about radio concepts amongst media practitioners in China, they label such people amateur radio enthusiasts, which can have a lot of negative effects on real radio hams. For example, recent web posts in the country have announced that Chinese radio enthusiasts have been leaking sensitive information for years, causing unhappiness and anger amongst amateur radio enthusiasts. Farcically, the authorities in some individual regions are calling for the dismantling of legally established amateur radio stations. In this regard, CRAC cautions that amateur radio enthusiasts in China need to take a pragmatic attitude in the face of this basic lack of common sense and popularizing suspicion of amateur radio through the misuse of specific words which have specific meanings. The phrases amateur radio and amateur radio enthusiasts have a carefully defined meaning within the International Telecommunication Union, a professional organization of the United Nations. China is one of the countries actively involved in the ITU, and the definitions of amateur radio should be made clear to everyone. Amateur radio is a radio communications hobby that is designed for amateur enthusiasts to engage in self-training, mutual communication, and technical research in areas of interest with no financial aspect. Amateur radio enthusiasts operate with the official approval of the national radio authorities in China. Receiving marine or aeronautical data, operating radio-controlled models, and listening to foreign broadcasts are all activities that use radio technology and equipment, but they do not belong within the scope of the amateur radio services. Those practitioners are classified as having interest in aviation, navigation, the hobby of modelling, and broadcast listening. Carrying out radio technology research is an important mission of amateur radio enthusiasts and is encouraged and supported by the Chinese state and society. CRAC says that radio amateurs need to bear in mind that ham radio interests stop at radio technology itself. The society says that beyond participating in the communications which guarantee an emergency response in times of natural disasters or other emergencies, Chinese hams may not use their own equipment to send and receive signals other than amateur radio, and they must not spread, publish, or use received information unintentionally. Chinese amateur radio enthusiasts have always been active volunteers in maintaining order and safety on the air. Every year, they put forward many useful suggestions to radio management agencies at all levels. They report illegal usage and provide assistance within their capacity for radio-related activities. The resolution of illegal radio activities often includes the contributions of amateur radio enthusiasts. China's amateur radio enthusiasts have dedicated many useful services to the country and society for decades, and at the beginning of this century they were pivotal in transforming tens of thousands of unlicensed radio users into compliant and law-abiding operators. The Chinese National Society believes that with the continuous advancement of China's scientific and technological capabilities and a better understanding of radio management regulations, the radio amateur world will continue to mature and will become more correctly recognized by Chinese society. You can read more at tinyurl.com/IARU-Beijing.
Retired QST technical editor Joel R. Hallas, W1ZR of Westport, Connecticut, became a silent key on November 25th. An ARRL member, he was 79. Hallas retired in 2013 but remained active as a contributing editor, handling the popular The Doctor Is In column in QST and the podcast of the same name. He had been a radio amateur since 1955. Joel was not only brilliant, he shared that brilliance with the ham radio community in a way that taught innumerable hams things they needed to know in order to experience success and enjoyment, said ARRL Publications and Editorial Department Manager Becky Schoenfeld, W1BXY. He was a fine mind, a generous mentor and colleague, and a consummate gentleman. He will be missed. Retired ARRL Publications Manager Steve Ford, WB8IMY, recalled Hallas as an iconic figure in amateur radio media, as a prolific author of QST articles and ARRL books, and even in the audio podcast community. I greatly enjoyed being Joel's sidekick for the popular Doctor Is In podcasts. He had a wry sense of humor, both on and off the microphone, and a remarkably stoic attitude toward the illness that would eventually claim his life. Hallas authored 6 books about communications technology, published by ARRL. His titles include Basic Radio, Basic Antennas, The ARRL Guide to Antenna Tuners, Ham Speak, The Care and Feeding of Transmission Lines, Understanding Your Antenna Analyzer, and the Radio Amateurs Workshop. Hallas earned his bachelor's in electrical engineering from the University of Connecticut and an MSEE from Northeastern University. He previously had worked for Raytheon as a radar systems engineer and for GTE as a nuclear weapons effects electromagnetic pulse analyst and as a satellite and terrestrial communication systems engineer, as well as for IBM and AT&T. He also taught at the college level. He enjoyed sailing, as described in the July 2009 issue of QST. He and his 24-foot sloop Windfall, fully equipped with a ham station that used the insulated backstay as an HF antenna, graced the front cover. Survivors include his wife of 58 years, Nancy, W1NCY.
Foundations of Amateur Radio. Right now it's 10:45. That piece of information is unhelpful without any context. I could just as easily have told you that it's 2:45 and it would be just as accurate, helpful, and meaningless. The point being that without context you don't know if I'm an insomniac, drinking morning tea, recovering from a late lunch, or putting on my PJs. If I'm talking to people in the same room, supplying the time happens within the context of that room. But if the world is our oyster, our room is a little larger, and dawn for one person is dusk for another, at the same time. Before we could communicate at the speed of light and travel faster than a bullet, time was a relative thing related to the location of the sun, and considered mainly by mariners and astronomers. Even with the advent of increasingly accurate clocks for most people, noon was when the sun was at its highest point, and the local clock was set to that. When our world got smaller because communication and travel got faster, people started noticing that noon in one place wasn't the same as noon in another place. It became a real problem when people travelled hundreds of kilometres by train in a day. Imagine coming up with a train timetable that takes into account each local version of noon. In an attempt to deal with this, railroad managers in the United States established 100 railroad time zones. This malarkey continued until the 18th of November 1883, when 4 standard time zones were established for the continental United States. Of course, being human and all, that was a local solution. Great Britain had already established its own standards for time for England, Scotland, and Wales. In October 1884, the International Meridian Conference, held in Washington, D.C., adopted a proposal that designated the prime meridian for longitude and timekeeping should be the one that passes through the centre of the transit instrument at the Greenwich Observatory in the United Kingdom, and established Greenwich Mean Time, or GMT, as the world's time standard. Why Greenwich? At the time, the United Kingdom had more ships and shipping using Greenwich as their reference than the rest of the world put together, and the observatory at Greenwich had produced the highest quality data for a long time. As an aside, on a French map before 1911, 0 degrees was centred over Paris. There are other wrinkles, like the fact that Earth isn't round, and as a result the Greenwich prime meridian is not quite in the right spot, because measurements didn't take into account local variations in gravity. In 1972, Coordinated Universal Time, or UTC, replaced GMT as the standard for time in the world. It now references the International Reference Meridian, currently about 102.5 metres east of the original prime meridian passing through Greenwich. It's on the move with reference to land because tectonic plates shift, and where it is today is not where it's going to be tomorrow, so don't go looking for a marker to indicate the IRM. Meanwhile, in the rest of the world, people needed to come to terms with how to standardize on what to call time zones. The USA establishing 4 time zones was just for one country. Depending on who's counting, there's over 200 countries and each has its own set of time zones, which each might include daylight saving, or not. For some, like VK6, daylight saving was voted on several times. Trials were had and time changes during summer were implemented, then reversed again, and again. In total, VK6 did this dance 6 times, and we currently don't observe daylight saving. Neither does VK4 or VK8. So not only does 1045 require location context, it also requires that you know if there's daylight saving happening at that time in that location, which, to add insult to injury, doesn't actually happen on the same date each year. It gets better if you consider time in another location. Do they have daylight saving? Is it on at the time? Do we have daylight saving at that time? How many hours are we apart? When is this actual event? And what if we're coordinating efforts between people in multiple locations? Did I mention that summer in Europe is in July, and in Australia it's in January? In case you're wondering, tracking all this is a massive job, currently under the purview of the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority. The person coordinating this, whilst wrangling the politics of naming things, including dealing with warring countries who take umbrage at having their time zone named after the enemy, is computer scientist Paul Eggert, the project lead of the time zone database. War aside, time zones are political. For example, Dublin time was stamped out by the British as punishment for the Easter Rising. If that wasn't exciting enough to provide local context, we use abbreviations to indicate which location we're talking about. In VK6, that abbreviation is WST. Simple enough, Western Standard Time. What if your abbreviation was CST? Is that Central Standard Time in North America, China Standard Time, Cuba Standard Time, or even Australian Central Standard Time? If your local time zone is IST, you could be referring to Indian Standard Time, Israel Standard Time, Irish Standard Time, or even Irish Summer Time. As radio amateurs, we hold global contests and we advertise our online club meetings and events. Often we refer to times and dates that might be understood by an audience of 1, but utterly confusing to the rest of the world. So what do you do with this? Simple. Use UTC. My time zone, called WST or AWST, is UTC plus 8. F-Troop, a weekly net for new and returning amateurs, runs every Saturday morning at midnight UTC. That's 0100 UTC. No confusion, no daylight saving. Everyone can figure out if it's worth being awake for, and I must applaud the amateurs from G-Land and PA with their contributions in the very, very early hours of their morning. So, next time you make some noise about a contest or any amateur activity that goes beyond the people in your suburb, specify the time in UTC. Who knows, perhaps one day even the likes of SpaceX, Apple and Google will start using UTC to announce their events. As Goldie Hawn put it, well, in my time zone, that's all the time I have. But maybe in your time zone I haven't finished yet. So stay tuned. Mono, Victor Kilo 6, Foxtrot Lima, Alpha Bravo.
In June 2022, a team will land on Rockall Island, more than 200 nautical miles from the west coast of Scotland and the nearest civilization. Their intention is to survive on the tiny island for 1 week, battling winds and waves in order to raise £1 million for charity. And Nobby, Golf Zero Victor Juliet Golf, has the opportunity to activate the rock using ham radio for 2 days as Mike Zero Uniform Kilo India portable. It's one of the world's most wanted islands on the air entities, and you can QSL via Mike Zero Oscar X-Ray Oscar. Nick Hancock is the expedition consultant and is the world record holder for occupation and for solo occupation of Rockall Island, setting the bar at 45 days spent on the rocky islet. In 2014, Nick undertook a unique and record-breaking expedition to Rockall. For 45 days, he survived alone on the rock in a homemade survival pod on a small ledge, barely 3.4 by 1.2 metres in size, surrounded by a sheer 17-metre cliff-edge drop into the treacherous icy waters of the North Atlantic. His expedition was cut short of its original 60-day target by a Force 9 gale that swept much of his vital equipment and supplies into the ocean below. The team's website is at www.rockall2022.org, and it describes Rockall as an uninhabited granite islet situated in the North Atlantic Ocean. The nearest permanently inhabited place is North Uist, an island in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland, 200 nautical miles to the east. The UK claimed Rockall on the 18th of September 1955, when 2 Royal Marines and a civilian naturalist, led by the Royal Navy officer Lieutenant Commander Desmond Scott, raised a Union flag on the islet and cemented a pluck into the rock. Rockall stands at 17.15 metres above sea level at its tallest point and covers an area of just 784 metres squared.
December is Youth on the Air month, celebrating and encouraging youth on the air. Rick Lindquist, WW1ME, has more on this report, filed from League headquarters.
Amateur radio operators who are 25 years old and younger will be helming special event stations around the world throughout the month in celebration of youth in amateur radio. Yoda Month stations will be on all bands, all modes, and any time. In the U.S., the call signs will once again be K8Y, K8O, K8T, and K8A. Get it? 3 new DXCC entities will be participating for the first time. Argentina will be active as LR1YOTA, Cuba as CO0YOTA, and Peru as OA0YOTA. Listen for these stations as well as other call signs with Yoda suffixes. Last year, young hams around the world surpassed their goal of 100,000 contacts during Yoda Month. Overlapping with Yoda Month is round 3 of the Yoda Contest. That's December 30th from 1200 to 2359 UTC. Check the Youngsters on the Air website at www.ham-yoda.com and Youth on the Air at youthontheair.org. I'm Rick Lindquist, WW1ME.
Last year, 28 operators in the Americas participated in Youth on the Air month, and this year, Youth in the Americas anticipates an increased level of youth activity from South America. Last year, young hams from around the world surpassed their goal of 100,000 contacts during the Youth on the Air month, with a final tally of 137,000. Stations in the Americas logged 14,000 of those contacts. For more information on Youth on the Air month, it's available at the Youth on the Air website, sponsored by ICOM America. For more information about Youth on the Air program, contact YOTA month coordinator Bryant Raskol, KG5HVO, or his assistant Keys von Osprey, W0AAE.
A video from the Antique Wireless Museum in New York celebrates the 1-century mark of what the museum is calling the triumph of the amateurs, which began with the first test on December 11th, 1921. The video tells how hams conceived of a historic test in 1921 that showed the world that the shortwave spectrum below 200 meters was anything but useless when it came to sending messages across the ocean. This was the now famous Transatlantic test project. In a 1-hour video, Ed Gable, K2MP, and Mark Arrl, AE2EA, tell how the amateur spirit of experimentation put ham station 1 Bravo Charlie Golf on the air with a two-base transmitter on 1.3 megahertz. The CW transmission from Connecticut by the Radio Club of America was successfully copied in Scotland. As hams prepare to reenact that day on its anniversary using a replica of the original transmitter, hams everywhere can learn all about the moments that made history on 160 meters. Find a link to the video on YouTube.
The U.S. battleship Iowa's original Navy call sign, NEPM, will be heard on the air on Tuesday, December 7th, marking the anniversary of Japan's surprise aerial bombing of the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in 1941. That attack spurred the United States' entry into World War II. The U.S. Navy's 3rd Fleet Spectrum Manager has authorized the call sign's activation by the Battleship Iowa Amateur Radio Association and the Iowa's Innovation and Engineering Team. The hams will be operating split, so be listening for them on 14.781.5 MHz and answer their call using 14.343 MHz. The activation will take place between 1600 and 2359 UTC. For more details, visit the QRZ.com page for NEPM.
Grants from Amateur Radio Digital Communications will benefit amateur radio emergency communication networks in Haiti and the U.S. Virgin Islands. The $14,864 grant to the Haiti International Friendship Amateur Radio Club will enable the club to set up a network of HF stations to provide emergency communications to remote areas cut off by the August 2021 earthquake. The 7.2 magnitude earthquake made evident the urgent need for better emergency communications. The earthquake completely cut off communications to some areas of the country, making emergency responders unable to get information on the extent of the damage caused and what supplies and equipment were needed. The lack of communication capability hindered the ability of responders to deal with the humanitarian crisis. The Haiti International Friendship Amateur Radio Club, in coordination with the Radio Club de Haiti, plans to set up an HF emergency communications network. Haitian amateurs have identified 6 potential stations, and the club plans to provide the equipment and personnel to set them up. Grant funds will allow the club to outfit each station with a small generator, an HF transceiver, a power supply, and a wire antenna. Working closely with the Radio Club de Haiti, Haiti International Friendship Amateur Radio Club helps to train new hams and to bolster the emergency communications network there. Meanwhile, the St. Croix Amateur Radio Club in the U.S. Virgin Islands will use its ARDC grant to augment the territory's repeater infrastructure, enabling the purchase of backup repeaters, improving repeater coverage, and training and equipping new hams. When 2 Category 5 hurricanes, Irma and Maria, hit the U.S. Virgin Islands in 2017, hams gathered to help. The 2 monster storms left the power grid and communication infrastructure in shambles, with 95% of St. Croix's electric utility poles and antenna structures dismantled. The USVI government's primary land mobile radio trunked radio system was essentially non-functional, and the Army National Guard couldn't be heard on any radio frequency for a week following the storms. Territory amateur radio clubs went into action, employing skills learned during hundreds of hours of training exercises. St. Croix ham operators quickly established a daily HF net to support first responders. A single surviving ham repeater provided limited communications between islands. These links provided critical information and communications for governmental and non-governmental agencies, as well as local emergency managers and law enforcement. The $27,955 ARDC grant will enable Virgin Island hams to bolster the amateur radio infrastructure and train new operators to improve ham radio's ability to respond to future disasters. The funds will allow the Virgin Islands Amateur Radio Group, a group formed after the 2017 hurricanes, to purchase backup repeaters, more resilient antennas that will also expand coverage, and training materials. ARRL U.S. Virgin Islands Section Manager and Virgin Islands Amateur Radio Group President Fred Kleber, K9VV/NP2X, commented, "The generous ARDC grant will allow the club to improve and harden the territory's critical amateur repeater system, and adding digital communications capabilities marks a new chapter for new and future territory amateurs." ARDC funds projects and organizations that follow amateur radio's practice and tradition of technical experimentation in both amateur radio and digital communication science and technology.
In South Africa, radio amateurs have provided communications to the Ironman event for many years. Ironman 2020, like so many other events last year, went the way of COVID-19. This year, there was a flurry of postponements, with event organisers trying to pull something out of the bag. Ironman 2021 finally took place on Sunday the 21st of November, instead of in April, as would be the norm. This made for a very much easier start for the Port Elizabeth Amateur Radio Society members who had the early posts, because they were able to arrive at their operating positions in sunlight for the first time. The team, of course, is better known as PAIRS, P-E-A-R-S for short. Tony, Zulu Romeo 2 Tango X-Ray, had the venue operations centre set up by 5 a.m, with several radio operators along the beachfront to cover the swimming leg of the event. Beach patrol is not quite as glamorous as it might sound. It basically involves following medics around, waiting for competitors to drop out. That said, it's difficult to call the early morning on the beach at such a nice location hard work. Road closures normally bring people in early, and several of the amateur radio stations involved in the run, which is really an afternoon and evening event, needed to be in place before the start of the swim. The cycle route took competitors from the beachfront along the shore to Shonies, where they climbed away from the coast towards Grass Roof, and then out to Seaview and back again twice. This route of 180 kilometres is quite an area to cover in terms of amateur radio communications. The PAIRS team utilised their Ladies Slipper repeater, the town repeater located near the Green Acres shopping mall, and a temporary repeater installed on the roof of the Radisson Blu Hotel at the beachfront. All of the repeaters were interlinked, and there was a crossband set up at the home of Chris, Zulu Sierra 2 Alpha Alpha Whiskey, to link the out-of-town Ladies Slipper repeater to the beachfront. The network provided coverage over the entire route, and given the topography of the area, this is quite significant. Some PAIRS members were in action all day, most notably Tony, Zulu Romeo 2 Tango X-Ray, who handled all the traffic at the venue operations centre. The run stations packed up just after 22:30, an early night as the event usually has a midnight cut-off. And Tony said that he would like to thank all of those who assisted.
The United States segment of the amateur radio on the International Space Station project has augmented its senior leadership team with 5 new members. In May 2020, ARIS USA created a new 501c3 nonprofit charitable organization to enhance and expand ARIS initiatives in the United States. ARIS says the new membership will support the variety of new functions and roles within ARIS USA. Martin Schulman, NV3H, will be Associate Director, working with Executive Director Frank Bauer, KA3HDO, in delegating routine tasks, enhancing perspective, and backing up the Executive Director as necessary. He will also serve as a member of the ARIS USA Board of Directors. Schulman has more than 30 years of experience in telecommunications, programming, and computer security, and is an active volunteer with the Sterling Park Amateur Radio Club in Virginia. Tom Henderson, W9YW, has been named Secretary, with the primary duty of ensuring that the internal matters of the organization run smoothly and efficiently. He will record and keep the minutes of all meetings of the Board of Directors. Henderson will also serve as the custodian of the ARIS USA Minute Book and additional books and records as the board may direct. His background is in IT infrastructure and system security research. He is currently the president of the Bloomington Amateur Radio Club in Indiana. Jenna Dunham, KE0AOA, will serve as Director of Volunteer Resources and be responsible for recruiting, training, and retaining volunteers, which are necessary to ARIS USA's mission. She will also maintain the volunteer database, manage subscriptions to the mailing lists, and generate policies regarding volunteer conduct. Dunham is an experienced nurse practitioner in Kansas and has served as a volunteer for 4-H, which is America's largest youth development organization, and the Stormont Vale Hospital System. Rita DeHart, KC4RMS, has been tapped as Director of Public Engagement. DeHart will be responsible for raising public awareness of the ARIS program. This includes the management of all means of communication with the public. She will also be responsible for managing conference participation. She has 46 years of experience in the electric power industry and is an active member of the Tampa Amateur Radio Club in Florida. Randall Berger, WA0D, will be the Director of Engineering and be responsible for planning and executing the development of hardware and software systems that will enhance the primary goals of ARIS USA, specifically STEAM, or Science, Technology, Engineering, the Arts, and Mathematics, Education, and Backup Communication for crew members on human spaceflight vehicles. His scope of engineering involvement will support the efforts of ARIS and includes everything within the engineering purview of ARIS, such as ham radio on the ISS, the Lunar Gateway Project, satellite development, and future government and commercial space ventures. Berger is an experienced technology officer and has been involved with amateur radio since the 1970s. In addition to Executive Director Bauer, the new team members will join Treasurer Carol Jackson and Director of Education Kathy Lamont, KM4TAY. The senior leadership team will also work closely with longtime ARIS U.S. delegates Rosalie White, K1STO at the ARRL, and Dave Taylor, W8AAS at AMSAT. The Director of Business Development and Director of Operations positions within the ARIS organization currently remain vacant.
Dr. Sunil Furtado has been writing in the Deccan Herald newspaper about shortwave listening in the 1980s. Dr. Sunil said that when he was growing up in Mangalore, India, in the 80s, weekend entertainment was limited to a visit to movie theatres, short drives to the beach, or watching national television. His father had subscribed him to a magazine called Target, which was aimed at middle and high schoolers. One issue had 2 articles on radio communications as a hobby, one about ham radio and the other about DXing, that's listening for radio broadcasts from around the world. DXing involved listening to overseas radio stations and sending reception reports using the postal service. Whereas ham radio equipment was expensive and had to be imported to India and required a government license, DXing required just a simple radio receiver. Sunil wrote a letter to the author of the article, who was based in Chennai, requesting more details. He promptly replied, sending addresses of international radio stations, their frequencies, and information on setting up a basic antenna. Sunil immediately purchased many meters of copper and galvanized iron wire. He set up his antenna on the slanting concrete roof of his room, between swaying palms of coconut trees on one side and a water tank on the other. Connecting the antenna wire up, he spun the dial of his receiver, and it gave out a crisp radio noise, the thrill of receiving radio waves beamed by a transmitter thousands of kilometers away and bounced off the ionosphere to be captured by his own homemade antenna was memorable. Sometimes Sunil eavesdropped on vague chatter on the fringes of shortwave frequencies at night, which he imagined to be either police chatter or perhaps smugglers on the high seas sending cryptic messages to their counterparts ashore. The monsoon periods were terrible, Sunil said, as fallen coconut palms would invariably destroy his antenna. In the article, he goes on to describe an amazing life in the hobby of radio. And you can read the full story at www.deccanherald.com.
Terahertz spectrum sits between around 100 gigahertz and 3 terahertz, at the very top of the spectrum range currently authorized for use. At the moment, it's used for limited scientific applications, including to deliver high-sensitivity measurements for weather forecasting and climate change predictions. But advances in technology are starting to open up further opportunities. Terahertz spectrum could, for example, enable terabit speed downloads for very short-range computer communication, robotic controls, autonomous vehicles, high-definition holographics, and high-speed wireless data distribution. There are also promising applications likely to evolve in 6G networks. To help realize the full benefits of terahertz, we intend to ensure our approach to managing spectrum is as flexible and efficient as possible, both to enable existing services to grow as well as supporting innovative new ones. The unique properties and capabilities of new technologies mean the rules and approaches to spectrum authorization that apply at lower frequencies need not dictate the way we approach the authorization and use of terahertz spectrum. Greater collaboration and cooperation between the different types of emergent spectrum users in these bands will be essential in underpinning an alternative approach. More details on our early thinking are available. We welcome views from individuals or organizations on how best to maximize the potential of terahertz spectrums via terahertz at ofcom.org.uk.
And now, with his segment on tower climbing and antenna safety, here is Arizona's own Greg Stoddard, KF9MP.
I wanted to take some time to cover some of the common topics related to installing antenna systems on towers. First, let's examine designing and installing an antenna mount for the side of a smaller tower, like the one in your yard. I have built a few homemade mounts out of scrap pieces of steel, usually built from a 3/4-inch steel pipe about 3 feet long and 3 steel bars about 1 to 2 inches across, maybe a 1/4 inch thick. Material like this can often be purchased off the shelf from your local hardware store or welding shop. You will need to climb the tower to measure the sizes and dimensions of the tower, legs, and diagonal members where you intend to mount the sidearm you're building. If you do not have access to a welder, have the shop weld together the mount with the ends of the straps onto the pipe, with about a foot between the straps, which would be centered on the 3-foot pipe. This will give you about a foot above and below the straps onto which you can side mount or end mount an antenna. Pre-drill the holes for U-bolts to mount the straps onto the tower legs. Then also do the same for the U-bolts at the furthest end of the straps from the mounting tube. This mount should be set across one entire face of the tower, so it can be hinged inward during mounting or servicing. After the mount is set in place and the antenna is set on the mount, the third support strap can be clamped to the mount and tower to reduce wobble. This is not a suitable mount for a wide tower unless you intend to mount the antenna close to the tower. The most common rule for mounting distance is 1/2 wavelength from the closest face of the tower. If done properly, would make the tower nearly electrically transparent to the incoming or outgoing signals. If you draw a sine wave on a piece of paper, you'll notice that the voltage at 1/2 wavelength is 0. This is why we prefer to mount antennas at multiples of 1/2 wavelength. At 2 meters, that equals 1 meter out, or 39 inches from the antenna to the closest face on the tower. Imagine the sidearm necessary for 6 meters. At 224 megahertz, it equals about 24 inches for a half-wave distance. If you have done all your measurements accurately at the mounting site, you can assemble the entire structure on the ground and make sure it all fits before taking any of it into the air. Since my homemade mounts usually weigh less than 15 pounds, I usually carry them up the tower with me, set them in place, then bring up the antennas and feed lines. This plan would change depending upon the height of the tower, other antennas on the tower, or how you feel about carrying cargo up the side of the tower safely. Sometimes it's easy, other times there would be too much risk of touching other active antennas, which would make hoisting the mount and antenna by rope from the ground necessary. It is obvious here that pre-planning is essential to ensure safety and reduce the number of trips up and down the tower. While I have promoted the idea of wearing cargo up the tower, I'm the first to admit that limiting trips on the tower and hours on the tower are the real goal in any job I do. Limiting both man hours and movement will also limit the risk of death, which is cool. I've seen a few different methods of securing amateur-sized coax to a tower leg. The most common I've seen is regular plastic electrical tape. The biggest problem with electrical tape is its lifespan. Mother Nature works to remove the sticky from electrical tape within the first half year. I've also seen cable ties used. As far as I know, clear or white cable ties are not made to survive sunlight, ozone, or Mother Nature's worst, which limit these to about 7 months or less, especially if they are flexed regularly. I think the black cable ties are the best for outdoor mounting. Lastly, I've seen 12-gauge solid wire with insulation cut to 5-inch lengths and wrapped around the tower leg and coax, then twisted. I know this type of scrap material to hold coax to a tower leg for decades with no visible sign of aging. I have also seen a black cable tie over several layers of electrical tape. And coax can change size and length during the day, so always allow for these changes. Remember, tower work at any height can easily become deadly. Money spent on books, videos, and climbing gear is well worth the investment. This is Greg Stoddard, KF9MP, reporting for This Week in Amateur Radio.
And finally this week, imagine a world in which your various internet-linked devices didn't have to rely on batteries to power all of your various devices. They've been on the wish list for lots of us, but now battery-free devices have made the leap to the list of possibilities for some researchers in Spain. Scientists at the IMDEA Networks Institute in Madrid are using Lifi and radio frequency backscatter technologies to make it happen. After 3 years of research, they've created a sustainable wireless communication system that they call passive Lifi, and say it could be deployed for systems in smart agriculture, smart cities, and even smart homes. A November 26 article on the Hackster website describes how Lifi happens. The article says LOT devices would transmit data by reflecting and modulating the incoming RF signals present in the environment, a passive transmission technique known as RF backscattering that consumes very little power. One of the researchers notes that when scientists began their work, Lifi technology and RF backscattering were viewed as independent from one another. Will they now make a winning and workable combination? With an estimated 64 billion or more users of battery-powered LOT devices in the world, there will be plenty of people watching to find out.
This Week in Amateur Radio is heard around the world on nets and great repeater systems like our newest affiliates, the K2IWR repeater on 147.180 MHz in Cortland, New York, and the K2MST repeater on 443.150 MHz serving all of Syracuse, New York. We welcome them aboard the vast This Week in Amateur Radio network of repeaters and nets around the world. If your net or repeater carries This Week in Amateur Radio, why not let us know about it, and we'll give you a free promo here on the air. All you need to do is put all the details into an email and give us the repeater call sign, frequency, area served, and the days and times that you carry This Week in Amateur Radio, and send it off in an email to w2xbs77@gmail.com. We'd be happy to hear from you. That address once again is w2xbs77@gmail.com. We hope to hear from you real soon. Many of the news and information items heard on this edition of This Week in Amateur Radio have been provided by the American Radio Relay League, the ARRL Audio News Service, and the ARRL Letter, the Southgate Amateur News Service, Steve Richards, G4 Hotel Papa Echo, and the Southgate Vibes News Service, AMSAT, the Radio Amateurs of Canada, the FCC, the Radio Society of Great Britain, and Ofcom, the South African Radio League, the International Amateur Radio Union, the Wireless Institute of Australia, and the Australian Communications and Media Authority, the New Zealand Association of Radio Transmitters, the Amateur Radio Newsline, the Rain Hamcast, Eric Guth, 4Z1UG and QSO Today, QRZ.com, the Tech Guy, Leo Laporte, the International Telecommunications Union, and various news sources on the Internet.
With special thanks to all our weekly news sources and to you, our listeners, that wraps up this edition of This Week in Amateur Radio. If you'd like to write to us, you can find everything you need, including archive editions of the news service, at our website at twiar.net. We would like to take this opportunity to let you know that This Week in Amateur Radio is produced and distributed entirely each week by our all-volunteer nonprofit organization, and that we do incur expenses for its future operations. If you would like to support us, you can visit our website for all the information. Our address once again is www.twiar.net. And now, for all of us at This Week in Amateur Radio headquarters and our news team around the world,